Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. Today we're going to continue our constructed set review for Phyrexia All-Be-One with the red cards. Duck. The plan is to look at all of these cards, figure out what cards are good in a constructed format, cards I think that are good in constructed format. I'm just going to talk about the cards and the context that they're in. I'm not going to rate the cards or anything. I think Magic is a little bit more complex than these ratings, some people give them. We're going to talk about the context that these cards might be good in a constructed format. Let's do it. Capricious Hellraiser is 3 red and 3 generic Phyrexian Dragon 4/4. It costs 3 mana less if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. Has flying. When Capricious Hellraiser enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. Choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them, copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. This card, exists in kind of an interesting context. It kind of exists, I feel like, in the same context as Phoenix does, in an is it spells sort of deck. It probably isn't strong enough to exist in Eternal formats, but if an is it spells deck pops up in Pioneer, I think this is really, really powerful. You have a 3 mana 4/4 that copies a card in your graveyard, which probably ends up being a draw spell or something like that. One thing that's actually really, really powerful, if it is played in Eternal formats, is this can copy big mana spells like Temporal Trespass or Dig Through Time or Treasure Cruise or things like that. So if that is the goal of this card, then I think and that's the high end of this card, then I think it could totally be played in these Eternal formats. Otherwise, I think this is a game ender or a big threat in a standard version of this Is It Spells deck. Sulfim, Mayhem Dominus is 2 generic mana and 2 red mana. Phyrexian Horror 5/4. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. You can pay 1 generic and 2 Phyrexian red to discard 2 cards and put an indestructible counter on Sulfim Mayhem Dominus. I think this card's really neat if a burn strategy pops up in either Pioneer or Standard. Now, Mono Red isn't very strong in Pioneer or Standard at the moment. However, I think cards like this are really, really cool because the issue with these burn decks, specifically burn, right? Targeted burn, not non-creature burn decks, are really powerful if they're able to actually get your opponent to 0 life. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but really often your opponent has a little bit of interaction and they stabilize at 5 life, sometimes 2 life, sometimes 3 life, and then they win the game. Sulfim makes your burn spells much, much more powerful and is a threat in and of itself. If you're playing a burn strategy, your opponent understands that you're not playing these creatures. If you have enough burn spells, they side out some removal, you play Sulfim, you can protect Sulfim. It pairs really well with Hezeret, other than existing among the same mana curve slot. So that can be kind of difficult, but it can give that deck that little bit of extra reach you need, again, with a non-creature burn strategy. Definitely not in Modern, though. This is not, 4 mana is too much for Modern burn. Speaking of Pioneer and Standard Mono Red decks, Koth Fire of Resistance is, again, 4 mana, is 2 red, 2 generic. It starts at 4 loyalty. Plus 2 loyalty, search your library for a basic mountain card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, so that's not very good. However, it's -3, Koth Fire Resistance deals damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains you control, so it's able to protect itself. And it's -7, is you get an emblem with whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, the emblem deals 4 damage to any target. So this is one of those planeswalkers that protects itself, and its goal is to ultimate. It makes sure you hit your land drops and can actually ultimate 3 turns after it enters, which is pretty powerful. The thing about Koth is it is not going to exist in a burn deck. This is going to exist in a big red deck, right? This is doesn't necessarily have to be mono red, but a primarily red deck because you need to be able to search up those mountains so you hit your land drops. But in a big red deck where you can reliably protect it and reliably ultimate Koth. Maybe even there's mono red control strategies that have popped up in Pioneer. I don't think this is powerful enough for Modern, but in Standard or Pioneer, I could see a big red deck on the back of Koth existing. Red Sun's Twilight. When I first read this card, it's 2 red and X sorcery. Destroy up to X target artifacts. If X is 5 or more for each artifact destroyed this way, create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens gain haste and exile them at the beginning of your next end step. When I first saw this card, I thought this card could be kind of cool in an artifact combo deck where you play a bunch of artifacts that you benefit from being destroyed and then can attack with them, or I don't know, something like that. I think in reality this card's just going to end up being a sideboard card. Destroy X artifacts is really, really powerful. effects like that are played across multiple formats, and then you having a like extra thing beyond that, I think is really really strong. You know, where you get access to those artifacts, especially against things like Urza Saga. I could see this played in the sideboard in modern decks. It might just not be powerful enough though. Like it can be really really mana heavy. 7 mana to actually like do something with it besides it just being an artifact removal. So it might be overshadowed by other cards. Vindictive Flame Stoker is a 1-mana 1/2 Phyrexian Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Vindictive Flame Stoker. And you can pay 7 mana to sacrifice it and discard your hand, then draw 4 cards. Its ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on it. So speaking of like a standard or pioneer burn deck, these are the kind of cards that like make that burn deck like over the top, right? It is a 1-drop. While it only has 1 power and doesn't deal a lot of damage in and of itself, if you play it on turn 1, start burning your opponent, and then when your hand burns out, your opponent's at like 5 and you can't quite get through the last bunch of damage, you get to sacrifice this because it has plenty of oil counters, normally for like 1 to 3 mana, draw 4 cards, and then finish your opponent off. Like it could definitely exist in either pioneer or standard burn deck, or really just like a pioneer or standard mono red deck if the mono deck has enough non-creature spells. Slowbad Iron Goblin is a 3-mana 1-red 2 generic Phyrexian Goblin Artificer 3/3. You can tap it and sacrifice an artifact to add an amount of red mana equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. There's probably some combo here. I don't know what the combo is, but probably some combo here. Moving on. Urbrass Forge is 3-mana 2 generic 1-red artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put an oil counter on Urbrass Forge. Then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on Urbrass Forge. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. So this is one of those cards that could be played in like a mid-rangey red deck that presents a threat that is difficult to remove every single turn, right? You play Urbrass Forge. The longer it 6, the bigger the homie that it makes is. By turn 6, 7, if you played this on turn 3, you're making a big dude every single turn. You're jamming in every single turn. And unless they have artifact removal, they have to deal with that dude every single turn. It might be too slow for Eternal formats, but if a like slower red deck pops up in standard, possibly Pioneer, but I doubt it, I could see this card being played. Churning Reservoir is a 1 red mana artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on another target non-token artifact or creature you control. And you can pay 2 mana and tap it to create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token to activate only if an oil counter was removed from a permanent you controlled this turn, or a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into the graveyard this turn. The kind of cool part about this card is that like it's really playing on that new mechanic of oil counters, and a lot of cards benefit from having oil counters put on them, but not a lot of cards have like extra ways to do oil counters, or really a 1-mana card that puts oil counters on things like passively. And I think that's really, really powerful. If you have like an oil counters matters deck, I don't think there's enough cards again for a card like this to matter in Eternal format, but it's really possible, especially if this idea of oil counters exists in the next set as well, for a red standard deck with oil counters matters to actually pop up, to make those cards even more powerful with a 1-mana card that also does other stuff. Speaking of Exuberant Fuseling, it's possible this could be added into the standard mono red deck as a 1-mana 0/1 Phyrexian Goblin Warrior with Trample. Exuberant Fuseling gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it, and when it enters the battlefield, or whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it. So it's something that gets bigger as time goes on. If something like Churning Reservoir is reasonably played alongside Exuberant Fuseling, like it can be a multiple power 1-mana card with Trample. And if you have other aggressive oil matters cards in your aggressive red deck in like standard, this card could be played. If not, it's awful. Speaking of aggressive red cards, Furnace Punisher is 3-mana 2 generic 1 red Phyrexian Warrior 3/3 with Menace. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Furnace Punisher deals 2 damage to that player unless they control 2 or more basic lands. Like, I think this is really interesting to like start punishing like really, really greedy mana decks in standard, and probably not good enough for Pioneer. So 3/3 for 3 with Menace, maybe out of the sideboard. But if any greedy decks pop up in standard, I could see this card being played out of the red sideboard, or if it becomes like really, those greedy decks become very, very good, could be played in the red main deck. 3 mana is near the top of an aggressive red deck's curve though. Gleeful Demolition is a 1-mana sorcery, destroy target artifact. If you control that artifact, create 3 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. So this is maybe the card I'm most excited for out of Phyrexia Albi one. This is like another Kuldotha Rebirth. Like, it's a good thing it's not a common, or that would push that red deck way over the top in Pauper. But this is like a Kuldotha Rebirth that can destroy an opponent's artifact, or you can like have an aggressive red deck centered around your own stuff where you have aggressive artifacts, or maybe like literally Experimental Synthesizer is crazy with this card. So you get to like destroy your opponent's artifacts, or like sacrifice things that you want to die on your side of the battlefield, like again, Experimental Synthesizer, to create 3 like red Phyrexian Goblins. Like, that's insane. That's so good. Like, this is like, I think red decks, especially in Standard, and maybe Pioneer, are going to be centered around Gleeful Demolition, and I really hope a lot of the red hosers are not artifacts, because those decks will not care because they're going to be playing 4 of this card. Speaking of oil counters, matters, aggressive cards, Magmatic Sprinter is 2 generic 1 red Phyrexian Warrior 3/2 with haste. When it enters the battlefield, put 2 oil counters on target artifact or creature you control. At the beginning of your end step, return it to its owner's hand unless you remove 2 oil counters from it. So a 3/2 with haste for 3 mana is like totally fine, especially for like standard rates. But the issue is like, you know, this card is played sort of like you play it, put 2 counters on it, take 2 counters off at the end step, you get it for another turn, and then it'll return to your hand. But if you have this oil counters matters aggressive red deck, which it looks like it's feeding into quite a bit for like a standard aggressive deck, a card like this would be amazing in. Especially like recurring, putting oil counters on things. Like, imagine playing that 1-drop that we talked about earlier. You know, you jam in, turn 3, you play this, put 2 more power on your 1-drop Trampler, have a 3/2 haste or jam. Like, that feels really, really powerful. There's been a lot of talk about Hammer Time decks switching to red, and Rebel Salvo is definitely one of those cards that might skew that modern Hammer Time deck into red. It is 3 mana, 2 generic, 1 red, instant, affinity for equipment, which means it costs less for each equipment you control, so in Hammer Time it's just going to cost 1 red. Deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible until end of turn. Getting those things out of the way for Hammer Time often really, really matters, and I could see Hammer Time playing this card. Forge Hammer Centurion is 2 generic mana, 1 red Phyrexian Warrior 3/2. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Forge Hammer Centurion. Whenever Forge Hammer Centurion attacks, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. When you do, target creature can't block this turn. Again, playing off these oil counters matters, red aggressive strategies. We're getting a little gummed up on the 3 mana slot, but that might not matter in Standard. I really hope oil counters remains relevant next set, so that things like Forge Hammer Centurion and these other oil counters matters, aggressive red cards can kind of come to fruition, because I really enjoy aggressive decks with like more going on than just attacking. Free from Flesh, 1 mana instant, target creature gets +2/+2 till end of turn, put 2 oil counters on it. Again, oil counters matters as aggressive decks. Combat tricks aren't super good in constructed formats though, but if the oil counters matters, it might not matter. Kuldotha Cackler, again, oil counters matters. This is a 2 generic, 1 red, Phyrexian Hyena 2/3 with trample. Whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. I don't feel like this requires further explanation. Again, gummed up on the 3 mana slot, so this is probably the worst one we've talked about so far. Sawblade Scamp is a 1 mana, 1/1 with haste, Phyrexian Beast, where whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Sawblade Scamp, and you can tap it and remove an oil counter from Sawblade Scamp to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So this is like definitely one of those really interesting cards that like reward you for casting these non-creature spells. It could totally exist in this burn deck, you know, because like even after your opponent takes over the board, like this can still keep dealing a damage every single turn. Would only be good in these like red burn decks, or really oil counters matters aggressive red decks, if it is a slow format, because you're like, even at this card's peak, you're only dealing 1 damage every turn, unless other cards really care that it has oil counters on it really easily. Thrill of Possibility got reprinted. It's a 2 mana instant, 1 red, 1 generic. As an additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Yeah, it's a fine red draw spell. If you're in a Graveyard Matters deck, this card's insane, just like it has always been. Hexgold Slash is a 1 red instant. Hexgold Slash deals 2 damage to target creature. If that creature has Toxic, it deals 4 damage to that creature instead. This card will probably be played in the sideboard of red decks, just to be able to take out these Toxic decks, especially in Standard, because this is like a really, really, really good rate. It's too bad it doesn't burn the face though. So if you liked this video and want to see more of these set reviews, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.